Thanks.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this evening. And with your permission, we are recording tonight's event. It is,
yeah, that's fine.
It is a real honor to host you and to have you speak with the Beth Tikva community, and by extension through social media, with anybody who is joining us this evening. I can tell you, Professor Cotler, that we had an incredible amount of people signing up for tonight's event. There are a large number of people who were eager and anxious to hear you. And it's perhaps been one of, sadly, I might say, one of the most well signed up and attended sessions that we have had in a very long time, which speaks to the very matter at hand, I think. So without any further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction. I'm going to then, for the format this evening, hand over to you approximately 25 minutes for a presentation on tonight's theme. And that will then be followed with various questions that we have received that I'll be asking. And if I deem appropriate, we'll have time, in addition to the pre-prepared questions, to take some comments and questions from our session this evening as people who are joining us live, both on Zoom as well as on social media. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real treat, an honor and a pleasure, privilege actually, to welcome Professor Irwin Cotler. He, as is very well known, is the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice, an Attorney General of Canada, and longtime Member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. You'll excuse me for cutting short your CV and bio. We would be here for the entire session this evening if I was to read out the lengthy version. It has been an incredible career with so many accolades, so many honors. It is our pleasure and honor to welcome this evening Professor Irwin Cotler. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a special pleasure to be sharing this with you and with Beth Tikva Synagogue, with whom I feel a special connection apart from everything else. Your immediate past president, Dr. Gershon Frisch, happens to be my own personal physician, but what I appreciate most about him is not only his medical expertise, but even his political expertise. We were just discussing matters just today as well, his incredible sense of humor. So any encounter with him for me is always an inspired occasion. So and I take him to be reflective and representative, of the synagogue as a whole, including your predecessor, Rabbi Zeitz, with whom I had a long relationship. So I feel very much at home with Beth Tikva, and the name itself underpins what I would like to have as our hope going forward this evening, namely Tikva, with respect to not only combating anti-Semitism, but in terms of a reaffirmation of our Jewish peoplehood. Let me begin in that vein, if I may. I think that sometimes in combating anti-Semitism, we forget some fundamental understandings about the Jewish people that should frame our whole approach, not only to anti-Semitism, but to who we are and what we aspire to be. If I may, because I didn't prepare any remarks, I thought we were going to go right to Q&A, but let me just share one particular experience which will maybe reflect what I mean. After I was sworn in as Minister of Justice, I was told as I was walking to my office for the first time that there were a group of, as we then would call them, Aboriginal law students from a Kitzarak Law School in Nunavut that were waiting to meet with me. So my first meeting with any group anywhere in Canada was with Indigenous law students. And I never forgot that encounter. And their first words to me, they said, Professor Cotler, we're not just law students, we're Aboriginal law students. We come with a past, with a history, with a heritage, with a culture, with our own spirituality, with our own languages, with our own Indigenous legal system. And we've been dispossessed from all that. We've been disconnected from our history and our heritage and our culture and our language and our traditions and our legal system, and whatever we do, we feel a great deal of pain because we believe that the Canadian people don't understand who we are, where we've come from, and what we aspire to be. So I said to them, I would like to share with them a parable that comes out of my tradition, but which could come of other traditions. It's where students go to their rabbi and they say, "Rabbi, we love you." And the rabbi says, "Do you know what hurts me?" And the students say, "Rabbi, why do you ask if we know what hurts you if we tell you we love you?" And the rabbi says, "Because if you don't know what hurts me, you can't really tell me you love me." And so I told them, while we as a government may not be able to understand, let alone feel the profundity of their pain, we will seek to relate to them in terms of that pain, in terms of their history, their heritage, their hopes and aspirations. And then I said to them, at the risk of sounding presumptuous or pretentious, I said, I also come from an Aboriginal people. I said, a people that still inhabits the same land, embraces the same religion, studies the same Aboriginal Torah, observes the same indigenous traditions, speaks the same indigenous language, Hebrew, and bears the same indigenous name, Israel, as we did 3,500 years ago. Whereupon the leader and others came forward and they said, you know, we thought this was going to be another blah, blah lecture by another white man. Welcome one Aboriginal people to another. And I told this story, you know, while I was a minister and then as a parliamentarian and all my encounters with the indigenous people. But I also told it in sharing it with the Jewish community, because I think we ourselves don't understand that we are, in that sense, a prototypical indigenous people. And more than that, that we are, in a sense, and this will be underpinning some of my remarks later this evening, we are also a prototypical anti-colonial people. Our entire Jewish history with Babylon, Rome, you know, dispossession, expulsions, pogroms, etc., on the road to, you know, the Inquisition, the Holocaust, and the like. So we have to bear that in mind when we are dealing with that insidious accusation of the Jews as a colonial settler state, both our ingenuity, and the fact that we are a classical colonial people. And finally, I don't think we appreciate the fact, the sense in which, you know, the Jewish people, the state of Israel, you know, is a multi-racial, multi-religious, multicultural, multilingual, multinational state and society. And therefore the stereotyping of Israel as a kind of white supremacist state is as false as it is absurd. And so these foundational truths about who we are, where we've come from, and which frame what we aspire to be is something that we should bear in mind. Now, this brings me to, go ahead, Rabbi, to ask something.
Well, I first of all, it's as profound as it is enlightening, everything that you've just said. But I'm going to ask a very, perhaps simple question, and maybe naive. And that is, as I'm listening to you speak, it is so obvious and so true and crystal clear, the righteousness and honesty of your words. And yet, when we look today to those who look at the state of Israel as precisely that, a colonizing, prejudicial, racist state, are such people ignorant or are people malicious? Because it boggles the imagination. It's so blatant, it's so obvious. You look at the multiracial ethnicities that exist in the state of Israel today. You look at Arab members of government, you look at Muslim Supreme Court justices, and example after example. It just seems so blatantly obvious for those who are accusing Israel of the crimes with which they are accusing it. Is it coming from ignorance, or is it coming from a racist sense of malice?
I think it's a combination of all those things. I think it's coming from ignorance fueled also by not only being uninformed, but being misinformed. And this leads, you know, to a second phenomenon that, in a kind of post-truth universe where there's simply no truth anymore, and therefore this allows for preponderance of falsity. And then the third thing is that there is malice and there is anti-Semitism in the sense that this is the oldest, most enduring, most virulent, and most lethal and global of hatred. So it isn't just a contemporary phenomenon. When I was talking about, Jewish history, it accompanies Jewish history from its inception.
And that immediately brings me on to, if you could speak, please, moving from Israel slightly, perhaps somewhat, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. Could you speak a little bit about what it is, why it is important that governments around the world are accepting its working definition of anti-Semitism? And could you please share with us what is your personal role representing Canada in this regard?
So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is an intergovernmental body composed of some 35 countries working in concert with hundreds of academic specialists and the like. It was founded at the Stockholm Conference in the year 2000. I was present then, head of the Canadian delegation. There were 4 Stockholm conferences on the Holocaust on humanity, and the first one established the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance itself. In fact, as we meet in October in Malmo, Sweden, we are going to be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Stockholm conference. It really is the 21st, but because the conference was postponed last year with the pandemic. So we are commemorating not only the founding of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as I described it, but also which gave birth to the International IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. And the question, about the importance of that definition, this has emerged as the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition that we have. But what is less well known is it is the most representative definition that we have. And I say that because it was a definition that was democratically adopted over a 15-year period from 2000 that I mentioned to 2015, openly, transparently, democratically, by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, academic specialists, and the like. And I might add that definition, as somebody who was sort of present at the creation, if I can put it that way, we first began the drafting of that definition back in the year 2000 with the establishment of the of IRA. At that time, I worked together with Elie Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha, blessed memory, and Per Ahlmark, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, also blessed memory, and others like Yehuda Bauer, and we began to draft what then became the IRA definition. Then came the Durban Conference of 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, which turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jews. That intensified our work. And so when we reconnected at the Stockholm Conference in 2002, we began to pour more content into that definition. And then, interestingly enough, we drew upon the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the equal protection principles in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to apply it with respect to the old and new anti-Semitism. In other words, that the old or traditional anti-Semitism is discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. In fact, even the right even to live. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, old and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is a move from discrimination against Jews as individuals to discrimination against Jews as a people, reverberating back to Jews as individuals. And so the IRA definition contains within it the comprehensive illustrations of both the old and new anti-Semitism. It is, in effect, a resource, I would say an indispensable asset, a tool, a non-binding definition, but one which frames our understanding of anti-Semitism, defines that anti-Semitism, old and new, and as we know only too well, that if you can't define it, you can't combat it. So this allows us to define it, to monitor it, to track it, and to combat it. And what is also less well known is that this definition is anchored in and was unanimously approved by the interparliamentary conference held in the UK in 2009, and then in the Ottawa conference in 2010, the exact language of the IRA definition unanimously adopted in 2016 by IRA itself, the 34, at that time now 35 governments, was already adopted word for word in the 2009 and 2010 parliamentary declarations, unanimously adopted by the parliaments of over 40 countries. And so this is something that is not just developed out of whole cloth, and there's a distinguishable Canadian contribution to it, and therefore a distinguishable Canadian responsibility in both enhancing the adoption of this definition and seeing to its implementation. And that relates to the last part of your question in terms of my role as special envoy. I've actually have, Rabbi, 6 mandates, interrelated mandates, preserving Holocaust remembrance domestically and internationally, combating anti-Semitism domestically and internationally, heading up the Canadian delegation to IRA, which meets in plenary session twice a year, and we'll be meeting again at the beginning of November. And finally, I'm the special envoy to intergovernmental bodies like the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the EU, and the like. So there are 6 mandates, and within those 6 mandates, the work with respect to IRA is, as I mentioned, a central theme, both to get more country adoptions, more parliamentary adoptions, but most importantly, to implement it, to mainstream its adoption across all sectors of society.
So let me pause there. If you see me turning to the side, it's because I've suddenly started taking out pen and paper and I'm taking notes. I'm sure this is no surprise in all of the classes and university courses you give, seeing people scribbling away, but there is a lot of information that you are throwing out. So I've started to take some notes. Let me ask you a question. There's a lot here, but I'll zoom in. One of the 6 mandates is to speak with intergovernmental bodies, the UN, the EU, not only to adopt the resolution in terms of the language of the definition, but actually to implement a tachlis, a practical seeing the fruits coming to be of anti-Semitism being stamped out. How do you go about doing that? I mean, these are global, international, political problems. How does Professor Irwin Cotler, as the Canadian representative and the leading role that Canada now plays in this organization, how do you actually do that? How does this get done?
So
seems like
let
an
me just give you
insurmountable task.
Yeah, very quickly and just one-liners. Number one, domestically, called for, and I was delighted that the Canadian government then convened. I was there as a co-convener of the first ever urgent national summit to combat anti-Semitism, which had participation not only of the Prime Minister, but 10 government ministers, parliamentarians, civil society leaders, and most importantly, a diverse expression of the Jewish community, not only Jewish community leaders, but students and let's say women of color who embodied intersectionality, Black Jewish women. In fact, might I say that it was after Trudeau addressed the summit to begin with, but it was after he heard the lived experiences, if I can put it that way, the witness testimony of the students and the Jews of color, that he responded and because he was visibly moved by that, and said, I just want to reaffirm that we are committed to combating the 3 Ds, demonization, delegitimization, and double standards with respect to Israel. What he attributed to me, it was really Sharansky who had framed that. And he said, we have condemned the BDS movement, and I'm concluding his remark very quickly, we will make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority, not only with regard to Canada, but globally, which leads to a second thing in terms of my role and involvement. We convened a meeting of the 30 Canadian heads of mission in Europe. It was convened by our Canadian ambassador to the European Union and to Germany, Stéphane Dion, former colleague of mine in the Canadian government, known to you as well, in terms of being an MP in the Saint areas, Dollard areas. And we then made representations as well to the 30 Canadian heads of mission. What I did with the National Summit in Canada, I set forth what I called foundational principles for a national action plan. I said we needed a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism. And some of those foundational principles included, number one, not only the importance, but the imperative of Holocaust and anti-Semitism education. In other words, if the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, then anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. The best example of the interrelationship is that, as we know, 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century. 1.1 million of them were Jews. So let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die at Auschwitz. It remains the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so, as Ahmed Shahid, my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, said, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. And we try to make the point, therefore, both in the National Summit in Canada and with regard to the countries in the European Union, look, this is democracies that are at stake as well. And a third dimension of my operations here was also to meet with the UN. And let me just continue with that national action plan. So these are the 3 targets that I had: the National Summit in Canada, the European Union, the UN, and other intergovernmental bodies in that regard. And in addition to what I said about Holocaust remembrance and education to combating Holocaust distortion. 3, what I mentioned, enhancing the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition. Number 4, invoking and implementing the parliamentary antecedents and principles. Number 5, combating the alarming rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes. 2020 was the highest year for anti-Semitic hate crimes, not only in Canada, but in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. But by May 2021, we had reached the same level of anti-Semitic hate crimes as in all of 2020, because the Hamas war was a tipping point.
Right.
Durban was a tipping point for the beginning and launching of the demonological anti-Semitism of Israel as a settler, colonial, imperialist, racist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering apartheid state. And the Hamas war just intensified that, and what we talked about the media. So the combating of not only hate crimes and its alarming rise, but the next objective, the combating of the incendiary hate speech on the social media. Here to give one example, a recent Israeli study showed that in TikTok, which has now 1.2 billion users, and many of them are of a younger age, there was a 912% increase in anti-Semitic hate speech in 1 year. And I'm just using TikTok, I'm not even talking about the other social media platforms. And so I was pleased when in our national summit, the Canadian government undertook, to enact legislation to regulate the social media, to make them accountable. And with regard to anti-Semitic hate crime, same things. What I said, the 4 Ps that are necessary: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships between the federal, provincial, municipal government, law enforcement authority, the combating of hate crime. Some of the last objectives is in the National Action Plan, European Action Plan, the importance of a zero tolerance policy for anti-Semitism, that political leaders have to call it out, not just in the other's political party, but have to call it out in their own political party. It has to be a zero tolerance policy. And then the final thing I might mention is combating the laundering of anti-Semitism under so-called universal public values, the combating of it under the protective cover of the United Nations, where Israel is singled out for selective opprobrium and indictment. Under the authority of international law, there's an astonishing datum of many that I can give you. That is, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention on International Humanitarian Law have met 3 times in their history since 1949 to put one state in the docket of the accused. It's not been Syria, it's not been China, it's not been Iran. I can go on. The only state ever put in the docket of the accused for violations of international humanitarian law on all 3 occasions when the contracting parties met was Israel. The third thing is the UN Council on Human Rights, which has passed more resolutions against Israel than against any other state. And then the final thing, what I mentioned, the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism itself, where Jews are held out as being part of the white oppressor class, right. Israel is the white oppressor state, the convergence of the two, and then you get all that misinformation, fraudulent information, etc. And on this point, I'll close. Anti-Semitism cannot be fought, and it cannot be won by Jews alone. It is a global responsibility, and it is a global responsibility that the international community must undertake, that the community of democracies must undertake, because it represents, as I said, a threat to democracies as it is a threat to Jews.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There is a wealth of information that you are presenting right now. I want to go back a couple of steps with some of the things that you have brought up. And one of the questions that I have is, what changed? What changed from the Durban conference of 2001, where Israel is vilified, or there are skirmishes with the first Lebanon War, the second Lebanon War, and the anti-Israel sentiment is localized. And what I mean by that is it's focused on Israel. Fast forwarding to this past year, a few months ago, with the violence in Gaza, and suddenly university students on the streets of Paris, London, and Melbourne, Montreal, are the ones who are victims of violence, with stones being thrown at them and worse. Horrific incidents of a rabbi being stabbed in Chicago, I think it was, last month, and vicious
in London,
attack
yes.
Outside of the localization of the Middle East. And now we're seeing attacks on Jews throughout the world. What changed over the last 20 years that anti-Zionism has now become an open platform giving permission for there to be violence against Jews throughout the world?
I think it's been a combination of factors, some of which I've mentioned, but what it has been the cumulative increase and almost incentivization of anti-Semitism by the almost indifference and inaction in respect to it. You know, as I said when I addressed the National Summit after the Hamas war, we found, Jews being targeted and threatened, Canadian Jews elsewhere internationally, in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in the communities. Synagogues torched, memorials defaced, cemeteries desecrated, community centers vandalized, all this finding expression in what I told you, the 2 things: alarming rise in hate crimes, alarming rise in incendiary hate speech. But what has concerned me and what has underpinned all these phenomenon. I've just given you a snapshot, in terms of Canada. This past week, we've seen a wave of vandalism in that regard. But what has concerned me have been four underlying principles that have underpinned all this. Number one has been what I call the increasing and steady mainstreaming, normalization, and legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture. The absence of outrage underpinned by indifference and inaction. That's the first thing. The second thing is the globality of anti-Semitism. And not only is it the oldest and most enduring of hatred, as I said, but the most globalized and ubiquitous of hatreds and its pervasiveness. And the Jews are a global family. So what happens, as you mentioned, Rabbi, in London or Paris reverberates back in Montreal and Toronto. But more than that, it even gets replicated. When you had a convoy that went through the streets of London with the so-called peace protesters saying, F the Jews, will rape your daughters, clear inciting speech. We had the same thing also here in Canada and in the streets here in Canada. So it's become a globalized phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which replicates itself. Mm-hmm. The third thing is, and this is very disturbing and not always appreciated, it's what I call the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism. Now, we all need to be engaged in terms of racism against Indigenous people, against Blacks and people of color, against Asian Canadians, against Muslim Canadians. But what we've been finding is that anti-Semitism has been marginalized in that overall anti-racism struggle. If you look, and I've looked into this, part of my role as special and responsibility special, if you look into some of government policies, both internationally, domestically, education and training, there's no reference even at times to combating anti-Semitism as part of the combating of anti-racism as a whole. And so I made it, a priority to ensure that our education and training at the governmental level, the school level, wherever we can, that anti-Semitism cannot be marginalized, let alone excluded. And the final part in this whole configuration, which is disturbing, is the what I would call the laundering, as I said, of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism itself. This turns history and law and morality on its head, and it totally inverts it. And there you have, as I said, the phenomenon of demonological anti-Semitism, where all the indictments of the Jew as classically as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, it now becomes the Jewish people in Israel as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And the references, as I said, to Israel as a settler, colonial, apartheid, child killing. So that's really the phenomenon of demonological anti-Semitism. The fact that it's been able to be triggered initially at the Durban conference and then institutionalized over the last 20 years and then exploding again during the Hamas war is that the indifference and inaction and all these other dynamics, as I said, have helped to incentivize that and make it possible. And that's why we have an individual and collective responsibility to combat it.
That brings me to the third arm of one of your responsibilities, which was to effect change in the United Nations. You just gave an example of the three indictments. It was only Israel that was indicted under such circumstances. We are so familiar when we look at the Security Resolution Council that 90%, 80%, whatever the statistic is, it's oftentimes only Israel who is being put under the spotlight for war crimes, for acts of racism, crimes against humanity, whatever the example is that the United Nations is choosing, it seems to be focusing on Israel. Many people have become skeptical of the United Nations. At a time in the previous administration, they stopped their funding towards the United Nations. There was a time under the previous prime ministership of Israel where certain conferences were simply not boycotted, but just not attended by Israel because of the farce that the United Nations has become. to what degree do you see your work as meaningful in a body such as the United Nations, specifically those subcommittees whose seemingly goal is to demonize and isolate Israel?
So on that point, just three comments, and very brief. The first thing is that as a Canadian, the United Nations, I grew up as part of our DNA. International law as a centerpiece almost of our identity. Human rights as an organizing idiom of our foreign policy, which leads me to the second point, that if we say, as I said, and tried to point out, that all this is, the UN had said it become prejudicial to Israel, the response may very well be, well, Israel deserves to be indicted. Israel, because that's the way things have changed. Israel is an apartheid. And I think what we have to say at this point, that as those who care about the United Nations in its historical sense as being part of our DNA, as that which was founded, let's say, by Rene Cassin and John Humphrey and Eleanor Roosevelt, the great human rights people, the same way with regard to international law, were founded, by the great people, and whether it be Raphael Lemkin or Lauterpacht, a lot of people were Jews who are founders of the institutions and of international law. Of the Rene Cassin was the founder of what is now the UN Council on Human Rights. He didn't envisage that it would be, a group of violators. The mandate of the UN Human Rights Council is to protect human rights. People on that UN Human Rights Council are supposed to demonstrate that they are promoters and protectors of human rights. So again, an Orwellian universe, and when things are turned upside down. So I think what we need to point out in making the case is that it's not that it's just prejudicial to Israel. What is happening, this singling out of Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment, where you have annually, let's say, 20 resolutions against one member state of the United States, which happens to be Israel, and 5 resolutions against the rest of the world combined, giving exculpatory immunity to major human rights violations, that what this is doing is, in effect, undermining the integrity of the United Nations. What this is doing is basically diminishing the authority of international law. What this is doing is corrupting the culture of human rights, including the UN Council on Human Rights, which is supposed to represent it. What this is doing is undermining and inverting the whole struggle against racism itself. What all this is doing is misrepresenting, the whole notion of what indigenous rights is all about. So I think we need to present the case in a way that, because a lot of people say today, well, maybe Israel deserves, they say, guys, do you care about the UN? Do you care about international law? Do you care about the UN Human Rights Council? Do you care? Because these institutions are going to be with us. So it isn't enough to just say, well, shmoom, etc. It won't work. If we walk away, they're still going to be there. It'll just get worse. What we need to do is to make this a wake-up call for the international community, the member states, those who take and say they take these institutions and international law to say you have a responsibility to ensure that this demonization, delegitimization, double standards don't go on, because this is unraveling the whole human rights system as we know it. I think that's the way we need to approach it.
So you see your role in part as reclaiming the original purpose of the United Nations, almost saving it from itself in that regard.
That's right. That's why we co-founded, co-sponsored the first ever, I say Canada, the first ever meeting at the UN Human Rights Council last February to call out anti-Semitism. And we had a meeting there together with my colleague, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, and myself, and Foreign Minister Mark Garneau, addressed it as well. Similarly, we convened a meeting at the United Nations, under the UN now point official for anti-Semitism at the UN, Moratinos, the former Foreign Minister of Spain, who's been giving that, saying, look, you've got to look at anti-Semitism within the UN, in the institutions of the UN, that whole corruptive dynamic. So working in the international arena, mobilizing, in that sense, states to adhere to their own founding principles and ideals which they've embraced, that is one of my responsibilities. The only thing, if I can say, Rabbi, you see why I'm smiling, is that I have these 6 mandates, but I have no support system. I'm the only one. I talk to my counterparts in other countries, etc. Each one has one responsibility. For example, the newly nominated special envoy for combating anti-Semitism in the United States, Deborah Lipstadt, her responsibility is to combat anti-Semitism internationally. There's going to be another person for combating anti-Semitism domestically. There's another person for preserving Holocaust remembrance. There's another person for being the head of the US delegation to IRA. There's another person with regard to representing the intergovernmental. Each of them has between 8 and 10 assistants. Regrettably, when I got the responsibility, it didn't come with any assistance. So last week, I've been given my first assistant. I'm delighted. Hannah Marazi, the Raoul Wallenberg Center, has been helping me out in that regard. So we have to do what we can, but we've learned, that's our own part of our history in terms to engage and see what we can do and be change agents and not worry about what we don't have, but make sure that we can with what we have to make things happen.
Well, I'm sure one Irwin Cotler is equal to at least 17 staff of some other country. So at least Canada's off to a good start. Allow me to ask a different type of question. We are familiar with the extreme model of demonization. Israel is a terrible state. Israel is the problem. When it's black and white, it's very easy to see. You take an individual, it could be a well-meaning young university student, Jewish or non-Jewish, perhaps not exposed to a Jewish education and understanding of what the state of Israel is. And today we'll look at some of the classic approaches of what is seen as human rights violations within the state of Israel, whether it be the treatment of Palestinians living in certain areas, whether it be the various checkpoints that they are coming through into the country, whether it be issues concerning water consumption, electricity being provided or not, and whether it is certain facts that are undeniable. And this individual wishes to criticize current Israeli government policies from within a framework of saying, I believe that this should be a country for the Jewish people. I have no problem with the state of Israel. However, when I look at their current policies towards the state, it could even be some of the more left-wing elements that a person would hear within some of the Haaretz columns in the newspaper, where they are presenting to their core left-wing leading speakers, intellectuals. At what point is that legitimate criticism of Israel? At what point is that a legitimate left-wing leaning political position? And where does the line then become blurred for it to be, now it has turned into a demonization of Israel? Because there are so many misinformed university students today, good people, well-meaning people, and unfortunately for our own people, so many Jewish misinformed university students today, the future voters, the future leaders, the future policymakers, the future of the Jewish people's leadership. Just this year, I don't think I'm saying this in my Rosh Hashanah sermon, so I'm safe in giving this over right now, but just this year, we saw one of the most heartbreaking moments of the year for me, which was a petition of 150 rabbinical and cantorial Jewish students from the HUC, and as well as from the Reform movement, as well as from other liberal-leaning organizations, coming out in desperate criticism of Israel, specifically in response to their defense of themselves after the Gaza hostilities this year. And to have 150 Jewish rabbinical students, cantorial students, damning Israel in response to what was self-defense was not only the heartbreaking moment, one of the heartbreaking moments of this year, but a tragic moment as well. So when we look at the young university students, young CJEP students who are well-meaning, who want to take on the woes and ills of the world as their cause, where is that dividing line of legitimate criticism versus what is then outside of the pale?
Well, I think, as I said, that, and the IRA definition expressly says it, that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. And in fact, there was a unanimous resolution, not well known, adopted by the Canadian Parliament, February 2015, which says that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. So there is this unanimous resolution, but that's not enough, because there are people, as I say, who are well-meaning, and part of the problem is the post-truth universe. Part of the problem is that Israel is such a very a country of a culture of argument. Now, within the culture of argument, all arguments can be debated, and it's okay. But the problem is that when one selectively takes out of that culture of argument, let's say if people over here would only take out and read and be exposed to and understand what is in the Haaretz, then they won't be getting a full picture of Israel. I'm not saying they shouldn't read Haaretz. I read it every day. I'm just saying that if you're in Israel and you read Haaretz, but you read all the other papers, so you get a compendium of a culture of argument. Unfortunately, what you got with those rabbinical students, and not only that, I got a kind of a petition from 500 Jewish scholars who were objecting to the IRA definition.
Wow.
But when I read it, my sense was they didn't understand the IRA definition. They didn't even know about the IRA, because that the IRA definition was silencing speech. It's the other way around. The whole purpose of the IRA definition, as I said, is anchored in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in the equal protection of law, the equal rights principles I described. But it's also to protect speech. It's to protect the speech of students, Jewish students on the campus, and their supporters who are being increasingly marginalized, excluded, told that they have to choose between their Jewish identity and acceptance in the so-called progressive campus culture. So this is to provide a protective framework for university administrators with regard to protect speech, including protecting the speech of those who want to be pro-Palestinian, unless it crosses the line, as the IRA definition would identify, into demonological anti-Semitism, genocidal that's not protected speech. On the contrary, as Ahmed Shahid reminds us, that we have an international treaty obligation to prohibit incitement to hostility, discrimination, and violence. This is an obligation. So one can't just speak in terms of the abstractions of free speech. And I've written as a law professor extensively on this, and that is, this kind of hate speech is not protected speech. Not even the First Amendment of the United States, which some people pass off as if all speech is protected speech. Not at all. Perjury is not protected speech because of the need of the right to a fair trial. Child pornography is not protected speech because of the need to protect children. Misleading consumer advertising is not protected speech. And so, the silliness sometimes that the IRA definition silences speech is the other way around. It actually protects speech, as I intend now. I had an experience today which was very revealing in terms of everything that we discussed. And that was just today, there was references made with regard to the discrimination, anti-Semitic expressions in the University of Toronto medical faculty. And there was a video and testimony by students sharing their own lived experiences. And I know, Rabbi, one of the questions you thought you might ask me about, are Jews in Canada safe? And the interesting thing I'm recalling, because, we're safe in the sense I don't think there's any imminent fear of a pogrom. We're safe in the sense that there's no imminent fear of Jews being physically attacked in their communities. So we have incidences of such attacks, as you've mentioned, but not as a community. But what these students were describing today, and frankly, I'm just right out of their language here. We feel unsafe as students.
Right.
Anti-Semitism is unrecognized, and people are not responding to our complaints. And then one doctor said that she felt unsafe sharing information about a Jewish Israeli patient, because when she just mentioned that it was a Jewish Israeli patient, the other staff members rolled their eyes. And she said, I was in a terrible position.
Wow.
I had to share information for medical reasons. And yet, on the other hand, if I designated the person who was, as they were, a Jewish Israeli, will they be getting fair treatment? In other words, this is corrupting public health in this country. And as I said, we have an ongoing feeling. I'm quoting directly from the students today, not only students, doctors already, ongoing feeling of fear and insecurity. And so what we're finding is that this is more pervasive than we know. It's there in the campus culture, but it's going beyond the campus culture. It's going into the healthcare system and the like. And so this is something where, as I said today in speaking with the administrators, you have to adopt the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It's a non-binding definition, but it's there as a resource. It's there as a tool. It's there as an educational framework. It's there as an indispensable asset for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There is a exceptional passage in the works of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, a dear teacher of mine, and I know a close friend of yours, where he writes of a luncheon that takes place in Jerusalem. And he starts speaking about anti-Semitism. And he goes on in his books, it's very unusual for him. He doesn't typically in his Divrei Torah talk about lunches that he has. He goes on to quote you. And he says in one of his passages, and there I was with, he said as a distinguished Canadian leader, but in a private conversation I had with him, he tells me it was you. And you threw out a line, Bilam's curse of levadad yishkon, of, well, the Jewish people is destined to live alone. And Rabbi Sachs, this is going back many, many years now, he says that there are two ways to read those words. Perhaps it could be a curse that we are a solitary people living alone, or perhaps it is a challenge to say we do not need to be an island if we will only make friends across the division and find people specifically in the cause of fighting anti-Semitism who will become our allies. You have mentioned Ahmed Shahid on a number of occasions this evening. There are those members of the Jewish community that very much take the first approach. Am levadad yishkan. We are a nation that lives alone. We don't have friends. We don't have allies. It's us. And if we're not going to stand up for ourselves, nobody else will. And on the other hand, you are working hand in hand. You are mentioning the various members and leaders of the non-Jewish community that are taking up the cause. Can you tell those who are listening this evening, what, in your opinion, is the state of affairs as far as the Jewish people having allies beyond the Jewish people who are leading the cause of fighting anti-Semitism? As you quoted this evening, the victim cannot be part of curing the solution. Anti-Semitism cannot only be fought by Jews. Are there people outside of our community leading this fight, or are we alone?
No, I don't think there is a certain aloneness, and some of that aloneness is also for good reasons. Indigeneity has a certain aloneness because of uniqueness, because of the nature of one's history and the like. So in some sense, peoples all have a certain uniqueness and aloneness, and the Jewish people more maybe than others. But the thing is, there are allies out there, and we have to engage. We have to reach out. We can't be cynical and just say everybody's anti-Semitic and just dispense to begin with. So my sense is engage. I used to say, Rabbi, I haven't said it for a long time, but I used to say when after Durban, when it broke at the time, I came back from Durban, and I'll never forget it because it implanted itself on my psyche as well as on my memory. I flew back from Durban. I arrived the night before 9/11. And so, as one of my colleagues said after 9/11, we're approaching the 20th anniversary of both 9/11 and Durban. He said, 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror but Durban was the Mein Kampf. That was when the blueprint was developed. And we didn't really challenge that blueprint enough as it was developing. And I think that's part of the problem. I remember I used to say that when I would address a Jewish audience, I say, what you need to do is to make the case, not to your fellow Jews, make the case to 10 non-Jews. I want each one of you here, not in the next day, not in the next week, because you won't do it, but in the next month, in the next months, sensitize, engage, make 10 non-Jews aware of the Jewish people's case and cause. But if you say to me, I'm not sure, as one of them told me, that I know 10 non-Jews, I said, that's part of the problem. And as another one said to me, even if I knew 10 non-Jews, I'm not sure I can make the case, then that's an even greater part of the problem. Like say ulmad, in other words, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. We have to know our case. We have to study our case. We have to know it inside out if we want to make the case to others. And in making the case to the others, you always, as I have to say, inhabit the psyche of the receiver. You have to be where they are. I'll give one example. When I was elected in a by-election to the Canadian Parliament in November 1999, I attended my first caucus meeting, the Liberal caucus. I really, didn't know most of the people there. At the end of the caucus meeting, a woman got up. I then learned who she was, Carolyn Bennett, and she said, she was chair of the Women's Caucus, and she said, you're all invited to our weekly Women's Caucus meeting, and it's in room X. So I go to the room, I walk in, I only see women there, and I say, oh, I think I may have made a mistake. They said, no, we invited the whole caucus. You're welcome to be here with our caucus meeting. The next week, Carolyn Bennett gets up the caucus meeting. She said, our women's caucus will be meeting again, and we now have our first male caucus member, Irwin Cotler, but you're all invited. To sum it up, Rabbi, for 10 years, I was the only male caucus member of the Women's Caucus. Now, why I'm saying this is I didn't join the Women's Caucus and in the first caucus meeting say, guys, I want you to know about Israel. So that Women's Caucus meeting was the best meeting of the week because we talked about real life issues. We talked about childcare. We talked about healthcare. We talked about the environment. And I engaged with them on the things that they cared about. After developing relationships with regard to those shared issues that we all cared about, then in a relationship of trust, I could start then speaking and relating with regard to Israel and beginning with Israel through its health system, Israel through the environmental, and then brought the Women's Caucus to Israel. And that Women's Caucus then became pro-Israeli because the Israeli experience related to them also in terms of the things they cared about and which Israel was so committed to healthcare, to environment, to childcare. That's what we need to do. We have to make the case to people in terms of where they're at. And in order to make it in terms of where they're at, we've got to engage with them, know where they're at, and know where we have to be at in terms of making our case.
Exceptional. As we wrap up, I'd like to give you some closing remarks to share with us where you see Canada and this global fight, where you see the trajectory going over the next year. We stand on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in just a short while. What will this struggle look like over the next year?
Well, as I said at the summit, I said in my closing words, I said, I don't see this summit as a one-time thing. I said, I haven't shared a national action plan, for a one-time encounter. I said, I see this as the beginning of an ongoing set of encounters and an ongoing set of obligations to implement. I said, if I've shared 10 foundational principles or 10-point national action plan, it's to implement that national action plan. These are the metrics for the next year that we have to implement. So whether we're talking about, Holocaust and anti-Semitism education or combating Holocaust distortion or implementing the IRA working definition answer or combating anti-Semitic hate crime or combating incendiary hate speech, et cetera, we have to see this now as a responsibility to implement. And therefore, I see this as an ongoing summit, if you will, to implement this action plan. And this action plan is not the end of things. You are all here, make recommendations, refine it, enhance it, expand it. this is a collective effort. I said, what we need is a Canadian and a global constituency of conscience to combat anti-Semitism. And if you needed a self-interest principle, always remember that while it begins with Jews, tragically, it doesn't end with Jews. And we don't want this toxicity to be, as Ahmed Shahid said, toxic to democracy and have it as an assault on our common humanity. So it's our collective responsibility for our common humanity to combat anti-Semitism. That's what I think as we approach Rosh Hashanah, when we approach the New Year's, we should make this as an undertaking, individually and collectively as a community, that we will make the combating of anti-Semitism as a priority, as a matter of principle and policy. And therefore we will engage with our political representatives. We will engage with civil society leaders. We will engage in allyship. We will reach out to indigenous people, Blacks and peoples of color, Muslim community, Asian Canadians, and we will join with them in common cause in their combating of racism and engage them with us in the collective combating of racism, of which anti-Semitism, as I always say, is the oldest and most enduring of hatreds.
Exceptional. My blessing to you is that the Canadian government will give you the considerable additional resources available, so that it will not just be an example of look what the United States has in terms of 6 different department heads for each of these challenges, but rather you will be joined by all of an additional 5 leaders who can also combat anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment together with you. And hopefully the resources will be given by the federal level for you to truly do the job that everybody knows that you can. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much. I feel that I know that this could go on for many hours, and there is a lot of information here. I've made notes. I'm going to rewatch this video because it was fascinating and I've learned a lot. And allow me on a personal level to wish you, your family, a Shana Tova U'Metuka. There should be good health for all of your family, and you should see success from all of the fruits of your labors in the coming year. Thank you so much, Professor Cotler. It's truly appreciated.
Thank you, Rabbi. All we need to do is to live by Hillel's teaching, Im en ani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Ushani latzmi mani, if I'm only for myself, when am I? Im lo achshav ematai, if not now, when? The struggle has to have a sense of urgency about it. So I want to thank you and your congregants, your community, those listening, because I think we've learned in our history that we can make things happen. If I just can quote Robert Kennedy, because it always impacted on me when he said, some people see things in the world and ask why. I see things as they might be and ask why not. So with our collective history behind us to inspire us, why not? We can go forward with the Emanili Milu Shani Vimla Akshav Emata.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is so appreciated. And please know that this is being recorded. It will be sent out on YouTube to our entire community. Those who are not watching live, I can assure you there will be so many people watching this at a later point. Thank you so much for everything.
Not at all.
Shana Tova. Okay.